Hello, everyone, and welcome to the webcast. My name is Christine Dorsey Davis. I'm the Executive Director of the Ohio chapter of the American Planning Association, and I am your webcast moderator. Today is Friday, July 16th, and we will hear the presentation, Street Commerce, the Hidden Structure of Retail Location Patterns and Vibrant Sidewalks. For technical help during today's webcast, you can type your questions in the chat box found in your GoToWebinar tool panel. And for your content questions related to the presentation, again, just type those in the chat box and we will answer those at the end of the presentation during the Q&A. Coming up on your screen is a list of our sponsoring APA chapters and divisions for 2021. Thanks to all of those participating sponsors for making these webcasts possible and free to members. Today we are sponsored by the Urban Design and Preservation Division, and you will hear more about them in just a moment, so thanks to you. Coming up on your screen is a list of our upcoming webcasts. You can register for these and more by visiting ohioplanning.org/planningwebcast. We are booked almost completely through the end of December for all of our Fridays. I believe we're going to have some Thursdays sprinkled in here shortly, so be sure to head over to our website to register for these and more. Today's session has been approved for 1.5 CM credits for live viewing. You can log your credits by heading over to planning.org, log into your My APA account, and from there in the CM search, you can search either by today's title or event number, both of which can be found again on our webcast website, ohioplanning.org/planningwebcast. Make sure you like us on Facebook, just search Planning Webcast Series and we'll pop up. That's where I post any important information like date or time changes, when I have new sessions available for you to register for. So be sure to like us on Facebook to get all that up-to-date info. And we record all of our webcasts and post them onto our YouTube channel. So again, just search Planning Webcast Series in YouTube and we'll pop up. We have well over 350 videos, so be sure to subscribe because then you'll get notified when there is a new session available for you to view. So don't forget to head over there and check out some of our 300 plus recordings. That is the end of my housekeeping items. So I am now going to turn it over here for the Urban Design and Preservation Division to do an introduction. If I can get my screen to go to the next slide. Jim Barnes, take it away.
You got it. Thank you, Christine. Again, good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you're at, for joining us today. Thank you again. And thank you to Ohio APA for pretty much putting this whole thing together and keeping it running and keeping us all in line. I'm a member. My name is Jim Barnes, a member of the Urban Design and Preservation Division, and we're happy today to be sponsoring this webcast. And the division is generally an APA division that's dedicated. You've got designers, preservationists, and related professionals that try and promote these types of topics within the field of planning and within APA. And we're happy to be able to participate in the programming that happens. And as you'll notice in some of the recorded programs in previous sessions, as well as upcoming ones, we are a regular participant. So we're happy to be part of that and part of the CM process. Today, what we have before us and what's scheduled to be a great presentation, as Christine mentioned, it's Street Commerce, the Hidden Structure of Retail Location Patterns and Vibrant Sidewalks. We have with us today Dr. Andres Svedczuk, who is the Charles and Ann Spalding Career Development Associate Professor of Urban Science and Planning at the Department of Urban Studies and Planning at MIT, where he also heads the City Form Lab. His work bridges city design, active mobility, spatial analytics as well. And Dr. Svedczuk is the author of the Urban Network Analysis Toolbox, and basically used by both researchers and practitioners in the field to model pedestrian flows along city streets and to study land use coordination with transportation development along those same networks. He also has a recently published book entitled Street Commerce, Creating Vibrant Urban Sidewalks with Penn Press, and Urban Network Analysis, Tools for Modeling Walking and Biking in Cities with the Tianjin University Press. He's collaborated with a number of city governments, international organizations, and developers on design, plans, and policies, both in developed and rapidly developing urban environments, and most recently including in the US, Indonesia, Estonia, and Singapore. He holds a PhD from the Department of Urban Studies and Planning and a Master of Architecture in Architecture and Urbanism from MIT. So generally, this topic today in this session will cover street commerce because it's gained a lot of prominence in the recent history here within the urban areas in particular, where we've seen the demographic shifts and a lot of the increasing number of single people and a lot of the childless empty nesters, together with the technological innovations we're seeing that allows people to be a lot more flexible in their workplace and work environment and hours. So it's changed really how people shop and dine out. So it's really important to try and see how these demands and demographics are changing and how we can adjust and adapt our urban environments to accommodate that. At this point, I'm going to turn it over to really Dr. Svetsak, who will guide us through this process, and hopefully also we'll have time in the end for some very interesting Q&A, I'm sure. Andres, back to you.
Great, thank you so much, Jim and Christine, and I want to thank the APA Urban Design and Preservation Divisions for hosting this. It's a pleasure to speak about this topic. See, can you just let me know, Orly, if you can see my full screen now?
Looks good.
Okay, great. So let's get going. What I plan to talk about today mostly addresses the book that Jim also mentioned. The book is entitled Street Commerce: Creating Vibrant Urban Sidewalks. And it's a book that looks at this phenomenon of urban amenities. And I say amenities to address retailers, food service providers, personal service providers, and some entertainment establishments that generally are street fronting. They don't necessarily have to be on main streets, even though we often talk about main streets. They're distributed throughout cities on secondary streets as well as main streets. And they are distinctly different from shopping centers, which are centrally owned. So when I talk about street commerce, I generally refer to as fragmented and not centrally owned amenity clusters. So in my view, street commerce is one of the very primary interfaces that people have with their own cities and neighborhoods. We all have our local commercial cluster we probably frequent fairly often. Then there is a district one, and there is a citywide one that we go perhaps less frequently to, but they all have distinct features, they all have distinct identities and histories, and it very much paints the sort of identity of the built environment that we associate with. And not only the built environment and the business clusters and the stores that are inside those buildings, but also the people who are attracted to those streets very much put us in touch with the others, with the community around us. And that's why one of the reasons why I find this topic incredibly important to understand is how do these clusters form, where do they go, how much of them do we expect to have in a given city, and what are the different levers and forces that can be used to shape their development. Jim also briefly mentioned that there are some demographic trends in the United States. Back in 1970, when the country was really mostly structuring around shopping centers on the urban fringe, the demographics looked extremely different. There were about twice as many households that were nuclear households with 2 kids, and oftentimes the woman not working or working at home, and half as many single nester households as there are today. So the demographics have largely shifted so that we have fewer single, we have a lot more single nesters who tend to prefer to live in denser downtown locations, and we have a lot fewer nuclear families with kids than back then, which helps, again, foster street commerce in more urban types of locations. It doesn't necessarily make as much sense for today's demographics to be in the suburbs and drive to a store cluster once a week in a car, and that's the end of the sort of contact with it, whereas now people frequent the places much more frequently. I also want to start by saying that streets have many different uses, and in my book, even though the main focus is on understanding the different forces that shape street commerce, I also draw attention to the many other functions of streets, such as streets as social spaces, streets as democratic spaces that are particularly important in the light of recent events in the United States, streets as even places to live. And why I find that topic important, I want to just highlight three key areas that have drawn me to really study this topic in depth. I want to start with a social argument. Why do I find clusters of street commerce sociologically really critical for cities as spaces of co-inhabitation? There are not that many places in contemporary cities where vastly diverse backgrounds, demographics, interests, incomes, races, religious beliefs, etc., come together in the same urban space. And I argue that urban streets lined with good public spaces and oftentimes publicly open amenities, including street commerce, are one of those few places where very different constituents come together. Here I've put up pictures of actual people around Harvard Square who either live or work at that place. You know, a homeless couple getting married, partly sponsored by the Business Association, to tech entrepreneurs, to children, and vastly different backgrounds, all coming together in a single urban cluster. When we think of other places where these things might happen, faith-based organizations, interest or school-based organizations, families or workplaces, then we oftentimes choose to enter them or we are born into them. So therefore, there's less chance of encountering people who are different or have different beliefs, have different backgrounds. And street commerce is, in my view, one of those places where that exposure to otherness, as Richard Sennett has called it, really occurs on a day-to-day basis, and therefore these spaces are fundamentally valuable, not just because of their economic functions, but also democratic functions, social functions. Mark Granovetter, in a famous 1973 paper entitled Strength of Weak Ties, talked about two types of social relationships, and one can really think about them in an urban environment. What he called weak ties, where ties with people that we may say hi to or encounter once in a few months, maybe even once a year, versus strong ties, which were those people we know and encounter almost on a daily basis at home, at our workplaces, or on a weekly basis at our interest-based organizations. And Granovetter argued that in fact, it is the weak ties that are critically important for social cohesion as a whole. So beyond families, beyond companies, for us to stick together as a society, it is the weak ties that matter more. For instance, he used the example that most people are likely to find a job through a weak link, through some connection that they encounter only a couple of times a year, rather than a strong link with somebody they live with or work with on a daily basis. And usually these networks of weak ties are much broader. But when we think about them in the context of the built environment, I think it's important to ask, where do ties even originate from? Where do they come from? How do we establish either weak ties or strong ties? And in the book, I argue then that, you know, while strong ties we're oftentimes born into, or our backgrounds direct us into certain opportunities to form strong ties, weak ties oftentimes actually can be informed by the built environment. And built environments that foster face-to-face encounter, that enable us to be in contact with economic and social opportunities on the street firsthand, produce what I call latent ties. Ties that are hidden, that may slowly become weak ties or even strong ties over time. But if we have built environments that do not foster that sort of encounter or interaction on the street level, we risk not having such diverse and cross-cutting weak ties that cut across different social groups and cities and end up clustering more into just heterogeneous like-minded groups without having cross-societal connections. Now, second and third reasons why street commerce, I think, is extremely important in light of contemporary urban affairs are also environmental and economic concerns. From an environmental point of view, I find it fascinating that in today's world, roughly 2/3 of all trips that people undertake in cities are not work trips, are not trips from people commuting from home to work and back. The majority of contemporary trips in cities are actually social, recreational, family, care, and shopping related. Many of these trips happen in amenity clusters. If you think about them, these urban amenity clusters, they're not just places to shop, they're also places to meet. They're places where you might have care related trips, and child care, etc. And the availability of such clusters can really make a huge difference into how people travel in cities. If we're able to visit those kinds of destinations on foot or by public transit without having to jump into a private vehicle, we can have a major dent on urban energy emissions and CO2 production. So enabling the non-work trips to happen in cities without having to drive, I think is a pathway towards more sustainable urban futures that we need to take seriously. And from an economic perspective, a number of studies have shown that more locally owned, smaller street-facing businesses tend to actually produce really interesting multiplier effects for local economies, because smaller locally owned stores tend to insource their services, their provisions from other local vendors much more likely than large national or international chains do, which tend to be vertically integrated and leave much less of the wealth that comes in over the counter in the local community and rather extract it outward. So I think from an economic development perspective too, there's this heightened interest around local economic actors that are largely clustered around these amenity types of clusters and environments. And this is also, I believe, why in part there's this sort of growing movement internationally to talk about the 15-minute city, which has become a real buzzword in the last couple of years, most notoriously perhaps popularized by the mayor of Paris, Anne Hidalgo, who talks about 15-minute cities. She has the sort of luxury of talking about it in a context of her city, Paris, which really is predisposed for making amenities and destinations available within roughly a 15-minute walk, because it's one of the most dense cities in Europe. But this has caught on internationally. And I think it's important to sort of move beyond this tagline and try to unpack, well, what does it actually mean? And what does it actually take to achieve built environments where a large share of our daily needs are accessible within a roughly 15-minute range without having to rely on motorized transport? So in the book, I cover a number of different forces and aspects that shape street commerce, from demographics to microeconomic costs to urban form and land use pattern to organizational forces between vendors that can help them collectively to economic clustering dynamics, to how building types and street typologies impact the likelihood of finding street commerce in different areas. And to some of the contemporary questions about how technology and e-commerce are reshaping the situation. So today I just want to focus in on 6 aspects of this. I want to start with a macro picture and talk a little bit about the regularities of how street commerce or amenity clusters distribute themselves in American cities. And there's actually a great deal of, or even a surprising deal of regularity to this. And then I'm going to change perspectives and go into the very micro perspective and to look at this from a perspective of an individual store to see what does it take to actually survive? What are the different factors that shape the survival of an individual store? And we'll look at an economic model that describes like what are the different factors that explain the density or the quantity of retailers in cities, then go into clustering and coordination, why stores engage in clustering activities, and I'll finish up with talking about some COVID-19 related impacts on street commerce that we have experienced in the last year and a half. So first, the macro picture. If we think about amenity clusters or street commerce in clusters, it's first important to sort of define how do we think of a cluster. And in this case, I'm going to use a very simple definition of clusters, where I generally consider stores or amenities to be a cluster if there's at least 25 of them, including the categories of retail, food services, personal services, and entertainment. And a cluster of 25 stores has to also satisfy the condition that no store is further than roughly 300 feet or 100 meters from the nearest neighbor. So there's a certain spatial cohesion to the cluster as well. Now, if we plot that spatially, and I've taken as a starting point the environment around where I am right now in Cambridge, Massachusetts, we can detect, using this kind of definition of a cluster, a number of well-known clusters of street commerce. This red cluster in the middle of the map is Harvard Square. There's a big cluster along Massachusetts Avenue around Central Square. There's other well-known squares of the area like Porter and Union and Davis Square and so forth. And if we take a larger look at it in the entire metropolitan area of Boston, and here I don't show individual stores anymore, but I just show a single dot for a cluster, and so that the radius of the circle approximates the size of the cluster. Then we also see some well-known clusters. There was Harvard Square over here, but there's Back Bay and the Newbury Street area. There's downtown, there's Little Italy or North End, the Beacon Street, Charles Street clusters, and so forth, the Galleria Mall area. There's clusters that are spread out in different sizes throughout the metropolitan area. We could do the same plot for a different city. This is clusters of street commerce distributed across Los Angeles, which, surprising to some, actually has a very high degree of street commerce that are not just shopping malls, but local street-facing commercial clusters, many of them also ethnic. Here are the clusters of street commerce around Washington, D.C. And what's perhaps surprising about these patterns when we look at this macro picture is that the total quantity of such establishments that form street commerce is highly predictable by the metropolitan population. And to economists, this may be not surprising, and in fact, we could even talk about the sort of sublinear scaling rules here, because it, as a metropolitan area grows, there is actually slightly less than proportional number of establishments per capita or per resident. But the scatter around this trend line, which measures on the y-axis the number of establishments, on the x-axis the number of residents, the fact that the scatter is fairly tight around the trend line suggests that the metropolitan population very well can predict the total amount of street commerce that any city or metro area can sustain. So for instance, if we look at the Washington, Arlington, Alexandria metro area, there was a population of 5.58 million in 2010, according to the census. And this trend line would predict that such a metro area should have approximately, or even precisely, 46,505 retail, food, and personal service establishments. The actual number was 41,000. So not exactly on the mark, but a pretty good approximation. However, if we zoom in to this trend line and look at some of the deviations, you see some dots flying over or below the line, then there are also some really interesting outliers. There are places like Myrtle Beach or San Luis Obispo and Paso Robles, where we have far more retail activity than the trend line would predict. And many of you know those places. Those are places that don't necessarily rely on just their local populations, but they have strong tourist economies. So in areas where you have lots of outsiders coming in and spending their dollars, we find significantly more retail and food service and personal service establishments than this trend line would predict. So for instance, in Paso Robles, San Luis Obispo, the trend line would have 2,500 roughly establishments. The actual number is close to 4,000. So well above the mark because of the tourist economy. Now, the first regularity I mentioned was that the total quantity is highly predictable with some outliers, as I mentioned, but generally highly predictable. The second very predictable aspect of urban street commerce is that it's clustered in predictably sized clusters. In fact, there's this famous and often used rule from geography called Zipf's law, which describes the rank size relationships between things. And in this context, I'm using it to describe the rank size relationships between clusters. If it's plotted on a logarithmic scale, as on my chart here on the right, then in log-log scale, street commerce clusters, these amenity clusters from downtown all the way down to small neighborhood clusters, form a highly predictable Zipf's law trend, which is exemplified by this straight line on a log-log distribution. What that basically means is that there are very few very large clusters, typically one dominant one. Then there are about twice as many clusters that are half the size of downtown, then 3 times as many clusters that are a third of the size of downtown, and so forth. Which means that at the end of the day, the clusters are exponentially distributed, that there is one or very few very large clusters, and then a whole lot more medium and small size one, and the most clusters we observe in cities are actually very small retail clusters. The same log rank size relationship in log-log scale has been used to describe city sizes across countries and even continents, but it really does describe the distribution of retailers very well. And what basically it tells us that not only is the total quantity of establishments highly predictable, but it's also highly predictable that they cluster themselves into these certain size clusters that take a very specific rank size relationship with a very large or the largest central cluster, oftentimes a downtown or central business district, and then predictably the cluster sizes drop as they become more numerous. So for instance, if I use this same Zipf's law dynamic to describe Phoenix, Arizona, then the Zipf's law would predict that Phoenix would have 25 retail clusters with roughly 25 to 52 establishments. The actual number is 23 of such clusters. The trend line would predict 9 clusters that would be roughly between 50 and 100 establishments large. The actual number is 8. It would predict that the number of clusters that are between 100 and 200 establishments is 3, which is exactly the number in Phoenix. It would not, in this instance, predict that there is a size, a cluster with over 4,000 stores, but there actually is one in downtown Phoenix. So it's a fairly good approximation, again, not exactly on the mark, but it gives us a pretty good guardrail to understand how retail, food service, and personal service amenities are distributed into clusters of diverse sizes. And we see that when we look at different downtowns. What's also interesting is that there are some deviations from that overall trend line. And one of the kind of interesting aspects of that is that how big proportionately is the very largest cluster? Is the central cluster always roughly the same percentage of all stores in the city, or is it variable? And it actually turns out to be quite variable. In places in Houston, Texas, for instance, the largest cluster is in just about 1% of all stores in city, versus in New York City, the largest cluster, which goes roughly from midtown to downtown in a continuous sweep, consists about a third of all amenities that New York City has in one large giant cluster. And generally, rule of thumb that we discovered here is that in older pre-automobile cities that are denser, in dense cities, the proportional share or size of the largest cluster tends to be greater. And this leads to kind of a behaviorally or perceptively interesting outcome. If we think about it from a perspective of the user, of the citizen in the city, and ask what percent of the population in a given city can actually access a cluster of street commerce with at least 25 establishments within roughly a 15-minute walk, which is about 1,000 meters or 1 kilometer. Then I plotted that outcome, which we've measured nationally for all cities here on the chart. And so unsurprisingly, New York City has the most population within its boundaries within walking reach of a retail cluster or amenity cluster, about 88% of the population across all 5 boroughs. In Manhattan, it's virtually 100%. In San Francisco and Boston, it's about 84%, 69%, and it drops down quite rapidly into other urban areas that are more automobile oriented. So if you think about Memphis, Tennessee, or Detroit, it's really in the single digits of the population that can walk to a retail cluster within the city. You can think about why is that the case? What does this have to do with density and the surrounding built environment? And I'll delve into some of these factors shortly. But the short answer is that in denser cities, obviously we'll have a far larger share of the population within walking reach of retail clusters. So on this chart, I've plotted on the top the cities where the most population is within a 15-minute walk of an amenity cluster. Cities like New York, San Francisco, Boston, Miami, Honolulu, LA, Washington, and so forth. On average, 61% of the population, so it's over a half. And in those cities, if we look at their residential density, their FAR on average citywide, or their ground coverage of buildings, they generally tend to be about 4 or 5 times higher than the cities at the very bottom of this chart, where the very lowest single-digit percentage of the population can walk to a retail cluster. So it has to do obviously with residential density, like 4,400 on average in the upper part of the chart, and only 1,000 people per square kilometer on the lower half. So 4 times difference there, with FARs and also with ground coverage being roughly 3 or 4 times apart. So density is obviously a key matter, but it's not the whole story. So next, I want to kind of look at this, the survival of an individual store from a micro perspective, and to understand, well, how does the surrounding environment really make or break the existence of individual amenities or service providers, which collectively, as they scale up, ultimately determine this pattern that I've been talking about and the density of stores citywide. So to use an example of a well-known American business, a Starbucks coffee shop, I want to just think about how many stores would it take in a town like Cambridge, Massachusetts to sustain a single Starbucks coffee shop in a decently good location, or pretty close to Harvard Square in this instance. So let's assume that this store pays about $12,500 rent every month, plus $1,000 on utilities, and its human resources costs, which consist about 10 baristas and 2 managers, add up to roughly $16,000 each month. So that means that the store has to offset close to $30,000 every month in fixed costs. This doesn't include any of the variable costs like the coffees and the pastries they serve. These are just month-to-month fixed costs. So if a store uses roughly 70% of those to the income that it receives to cover the fixed costs, that means roughly of every $5 that comes in, roughly $3.50 go to covering those rents, human resource costs, and utilities. So we can use this to kind of reverse engineer the calculation and look at, well, how many customers does it need to actually generate that kind of income? So in order to generate $29,500 a month, it'll need roughly 8,000 customers a month, or 2,080 customers a day, 280 customers a day. And that's not necessarily a huge number. There's actually far more people around to buy coffees, and there's a pretty high density of coffee shops. So this coffee shop is only one of many around that district, and so certainly many can survive. And if we think about a catchment that it would need, then if only about 40 people in the area visit a Starbucks once a day, then this would lead to requiring roughly 11,000 people in the daily catchment zone to sustain just one store. There's far more than that around Harvard Square, and even the likelihood of visiting shops is probably higher than 1 in 40 people. There's also outsiders who come in for jobs on the subway. So there's, as I mentioned, sufficient demand to sustain even healthy competition amongst different coffee shops in the area. Now, just to give you a view of how this picture of needs can vary by store, I'm going to look at a very different type of store. This one is a taxidermy store on Essex Road in London. And I lived briefly in London, and I used to walk past this every day and couldn't wonder how many people would it take to actually sustain a taxidermy store that would sell full-size mounted animals. It's not exactly a a common thing to buy. So that's what it looks like inside. And if we think about how its costs stack up, in this one is actually an old family-owned business where there's no more mortgage or rent to pay, so it's family owned. Utilities cost about $2,000 a month, and the staff make around $2,000 each, which is $6,000 a month. So it has a fairly low cost because of the family ownership. It's $8,000 a month. But if we think about who goes there, how often do people buy mounted animals? Here we assume that roughly 57% of the fees that come in over the counter go to covering fixed costs. Then if a typical customer will buy a mounted animal for $465, roughly $265 of that will go to covering fixed costs. So that's, again, useful to sort of reverse engineer how many customers it would take. So in order to generate that $8,000 a month that the store needs to offset, it needs roughly 30 customers a month, or just a single customer a day. And you remember with Starbucks, we found that it adds up to roughly 280, close to 300 customers a day. This store only needs just one customer a day to break even. And if only about 1 in 10,000 Londoners actually buys taxidermy products, then it would lead about 11 million people in its market area to sustain the store. And in fact, when I did this analysis, this was the only taxidermy store that came up. There are, I believe, maybe 1 or 2 more in all of London. It's not a popular type of store. And I use this as an example to illustrate the point that different types of stores, depending primarily on their frequency of visits that people pay to them, have very different catchment needs. And this is also, I'll come back to this point in a minute, but why we see lots and lots of coffee shops in cities, because people generally buy a lot of coffee, and very, very few rare goods stores like taxidermy stores in cities, or other rare things like specialized furniture or art stores, etc. I've plotted out the mean number of people that correspond to each type of store across 50 most populous US cities, according to the 2010 census. So you see here that at the bottom of the chart are types of amenities that require the least customers in catchment areas on average. So in these American cities, the 50 most populous cities, on average, there's a restaurant or eating place per 445 people, or a personal care store per roughly 700 people, and a clothing store per 1,600 people, and so on. But on the other end, on the top of the chart, are stores that require much larger market areas, like lawn and gardening equipment stores, which on average require close to 15,000 people. And there's also those whiskers that show the variability across cities, and the wider they are, the more this category varies. So in some cities, in fact, there are a much higher number of lawn and gardening equipment stores, roughly 1 per 10,000, and in other cases you have 1 per only 25,000 or even more. So there's quite a bit of variability in some of these upper categories. So we know that stores that sell frequently purchased things like coffee require far fewer customers in catchment areas. So we expect them to be more distributed around the city, because far fewer customers in catchment areas means that you can sustain such stores over much smaller catchment areas, and therefore they distribute around the urban environment more frequently. But there's also other factors and forces that shape retail densities. One of the very first theories that emerged to kind of describe how amenity clusters distribute themselves was developed by Walter Kristaller and also the economist August Losch, who kind of formalized some of the math behind Kristaller's diagrams. This was already written in the 1930s, probably familiar to many of you from the literature on urban economics. And essentially, Kristaller argued that there will be clusters that have higher order goods, like fairly infrequently purchased things like taxidermy stores, and then a whole lot more smaller clusters that have more commonly bought goods. But the model that Kristaller offered didn't actually translate into a serious economic model that would provide us a kind of handle on how the different factors shape that pattern. And here I instead refer to a similar model, but it was developed much later by Di Pascali and Wheaton, that describes the pattern of competing stores, very similarly to Kristaller, but with some actual math behind them, and does it on a linear line. And I don't want to go into any of the math or the equations, but I just want to highlight that this model of retail densities, which essentially describes of how much retail density are we to expect in a given built environment, is just premised on 4 factors that I'll go into some detail with. It's premised on the frequency of purchases for a given type of good, on transportation costs, on the density of customers, and on the fixed costs of running a retail facility, which is sort of the rent and the monthly fixed cost that retail outlets have to sustain. As I already alluded to with the frequency of visits, this model predicts that generally, the more frequently we visit particular establishments, the less distance between them, and therefore the higher density of them in any city. So obviously in cities like Paris, where more baguettes are consumed per capita than any place on earth, we have a boulangerie or a patisserie that sells bread and pastries on almost every block in the city. And there's just a huge density of them. And on the other extreme are places like the taxidermy store, where it's just so infrequently bought that they are very far and few. So the rule of thumb generally is that the more frequently things are bought, like food, like either groceries or restaurants, like coffees, etc., the more we see them in cities, and the less frequently bought products are much far fewer to be seen as individual stores. The second factor in this model deals with the costs of running a retail facility. And here I've included a picture of street vendors in Jakarta, Indonesia, who oftentimes operate actually off of these push carts that come around in the morning with fresh produce from the market, and they operate through the day for fairly affordable fares, but they also face extremely low fixed costs. If you think about fixed costs as in rent and human resources and utilities, they're very low here. There's no rent to pay. There's actually only a sometimes 20-cent city tax per day for the right to operate. There's a little bit of gas costs, and in terms of utilities, maybe a bit of wear and tear, but it only adds up to perhaps a dollar or a couple per day. There's human resources costs, but that's generally just a single vendor, so they are very low too. So fixed costs all in all are extremely low, and therefore the distance between stores is also low and the density very high. In fact, when I plotted and measured the density of street vendors together with other retailers on the streets of Indonesian cities, they tend to be higher than in Manhattan or London. There's an enormous density because the fixed costs are kept incredibly low, and lots of new migrants who are coming from rural to urban migration try their hand first at street vending. On the other extreme are places with extremely high fixed costs. Some of you may be familiar with Bleecker Street in Manhattan. It became to fame in the United States with the popular TV show Sex and the City, where there was a famous cupcake store on Bleecker Street. But Bleecker Street was one of these phenomena in Manhattan where the location wasn't naturally ideal for a top-notch retail street. It is on the Lower West Side. It's not a bad location, but it doesn't have nearly the foot traffic that, for instance, Fifth Avenue has in New York. But through a series of coincidence and happenstance, kind of including the fact that there was a popular TV show about this place, retail rents started rising on Bleecker Streets, and they went up astronomically, almost to the same level as Fifth Avenue. And so at this rate, many stores started shutting down, and it initially was a place where you would even have some local stores. Then when rents went up, all the local stores shut down and only international brands could keep the space in operation as advertising value. They actually made no profit whatsoever. And then as rents went so high, even before COVID, even the international brands started shutting down. So New York Times ran a big piece on this, calling it a high-end blight, with even the biggest brands in the world not sustaining their stores with very high fixed costs. So generally the rule of thumb here is that the fixed costs, when they're high, distance between stores is also big and density is low. The fourth parameter in that Wheaton de Pascali model deals with customer density. And that's another very important factor that explains how dense retail patterns are in different parts of the city. Here on the photo, you see a district called Mong Kok, which is in Kowloon area of Hong Kong. It's, I believe, one of the highest retail densities anywhere on the planet. In many of these buildings that you see here, businesses go up to the 10th floor in walk-up staircases, and there's a big table of names at the entrance by the door that tells you what business is on what floor, and you can keep walking up 7, 8, 9 stories to find a nail salon or sometimes a restaurant, etc. It's an extreme density, but it's made possible by the fact that Mong Kok is also one of the densest places in terms of residential density on Earth. There's roughly 300,000 people per square kilometer in many parts of Mong Kok. So it's a highly dense place, and therefore residential density produces also high retail density. So generally what it means that when customer density is high, retail density is high, and distances between stores are low. And the opposite is true when customer density is low. In many more car-oriented cities that are spread out, you have a very low average customer density, and the distance between stores is very high, and the store density is low, but stores tend to be clustered more in larger agglomerations like shopping centers. Last of the factors in that model was transportation costs, and I think this is a particularly interesting factor shaping retail distributions in cities. The model predicts that when transportation costs are high, the distances between stores are low and retail density is also high. This is because transportation costs don't just include gasoline or parking fees, they include time. And if we talk about cities like Venice on the picture here, where there is no cars, there's only walking and perhaps some canal boats or vaporettos, it's costly to move a kilometer because it takes a lot of time to move a kilometer or a mile. And therefore, with such high transportation costs, stores cluster very close. Venice actually has a really high retail density, similar to the places I showed in Indonesia, and higher than anything that, for the most part, what you could find in the United States, perhaps some sections of New York City aside. On the other hand, with low transportation costs, and this generally means that it is affordable to move a mile because the time costs of moving a mile in a car are so much faster and so much lower that overall cost per mile are considerably lesser than in places where we walk. You'd also find large distances between stores and a very low store density in places like LA, let's say. So generally, in car-oriented cities, cheaper to move a mile, and therefore average trips are longer, and stores are further apart. And in transit and walkable cities, transit-oriented walkable cities, people generally make shorter trips because it's more expensive to move a mile, and correspondingly, we have a higher retail density. So in those transit-oriented types of cities like Zurich on the left, and you generally have a pattern of smaller local retail clusters, and their patronage depends largely on how close it is to people, because people, when they think about where to go, proximity is a major factor because it's costly to go far. In other cities where we drive more, in most American cities, patronage may depend much more on the size of the destination than its proximity, because it's cheap to go far, and therefore we make our decisions based on how attractive or large the destination cluster is before making that choice. So we think about this sort of interaction between urban form, transportation, and retail visits, we have these two parallel cycles. On the left-hand side, a higher density city that tries to foster public transportation, tries to foster walkability, will eventually produce shorter average trips. And shorter average trips mean that most of them are undertaken on public transport and walking, which feeds into a denser retail patterns, which in turn feeds back into supporting higher density. And the opposite is true in a car-oriented city, where a lower density built environment produces long trips on average. Those are economical or logical to do by car, and it produces a sparser retail pattern on the ground. Now, the fourth topic I wanted to address briefly has to do with clustering between stores. And we know that stores cluster across very many different categories. Even the Kristaller and August Losch model from central place theory in the 1930s assumed clustering without really explaining why it occurs. It was part of the famous Kristaller diagram. But most of the economic models have assumed that cities are sort of featureless plains. Even that Wheaton and the Pascali model I showed assumed the city is a featureless plain, and these economic forces are played out in a more idealistic setting. Of course, in reality, cities are not featureless plains. Urban form matters a great deal, and in particular helps shape where retail clusters form. So even if we think about that Pascali and Wheaton model that I showed earlier, if we think about it not on a linear line as it was described in the original model, but instead rearrange this sort of pattern that they have onto across streets, it would lead automatically and endogenously to this model to a clustering of amenities towards the center of the crossroads, because this is the most accessible location. So indeed, one reason why amenities cluster in cities is because high accessibility locations where many people can get to it provide enough customers for many stores to compete with each other. And so there's just enough to share. But there are also complementary and competitive clusters. And complementary ones are generally those where you have a theater and the ice cream shop next to each other, and they complement each other and make sense to cluster because it lowers people's transportation costs and search costs, and more people are likely to come to such environments. However, maybe more tricky is competitive clustering, because we also see that in city streets where you have gas stations right next to each other, or you have clothing stores that compete head on with each other, or like here on the photo, a cluster of restaurants competing with each other. If somebody goes to a restaurant for dinner, they're not likely to dine at 2 or 3 restaurants. They will choose one. And therefore, the restaurants compete with each other. It's a head-on competition. So there are explanations to that too, and I'll come back to that in a second. Just to kind of use one anecdote to examine how planners have sometimes gotten the clustering dynamics wrong. One of the more famous anecdotes about this comes from Brasilia, when Lúcio Costa, Oscar Niemeyer in the 1950s planned this new capital city for the country of Brazil. And as part of the design, every super block, or they were called super quadra, was supposed to have a retail strip on its side. And it was supposed to be self-sufficient, meaning that every super block of about 3,000 people would trickle down. You see these black dots, these are meant to be people walking to the retail cluster from the super block. They would get everything they need from that retail strip. There would be a convenience store, there would be a hair salon, there would be a clothing store, a home appliances store, and so forth. And in between the two retail strips, you would have the delivery trucks who service them and bring the goods in. You can even see them on the bottom diagram of the trucks parked outside. When Brasilia opened, almost overnight, the stores flipped around. And instead of facing towards the blocks, they faced towards the double-sided street, which was originally reserved for deliveries. So instead, they shifted their facades towards the back. And this was because they valued clustering, because they wanted to make a double-sided retail environment where customers have double the amount of stores in the same distance from their house, rather than just relying on one half of the strip. And then the other thing that happened when Brasilia opened is that the stores quickly specialized. There were not every strip sold the same set of goods. some became flower streets, some became pharmacy streets, some became clothing streets, some are hair salon streets. They're highly specialized strips in Brasilia now, which was not anticipated by any of the planners. They thought that retailers would just provide all the diversity of goods in every strip, which is obviously what did not happen. So why is this the case? Why do complementary and competitive clusters occur? Complementary clusters are kind of logical to understand. They save consumers transportation costs and search costs, so you don't have to make several trips. You make one trip and get all the goods in the same place. But competitive clusters are interesting too, where you have clothing stores or restaurants right next to each other. Generally, comparison goods go and cluster with competitive stores. So if we're talking about goods that people like to compare from one store to another, like shoes, like apparel or clothing, these are kinds of things that oftentimes people look at from one store to another. They may try them on and so forth. These kinds of stores, including books and hobby, they tend to cluster with competitors because doing so increases profits for all stores in the cluster. They make more money by being on competitive clusters than by locating apart, because due to this likening of comparison, more people are likely to show up in such clusters than would show up if they were located apart. So I talk about some of this competitive clustering in the book as well, and I've actually gone ahead and measured how different competitive stores are likely to cluster here in the Boston area, and in this study we found that sporting, hobby, and bookstores are the most likely to cluster, or music as well. Those stores have the highest clustering coefficients if we compare them across categories, followed by restaurants, eating and drinking places, and followed by electronic and appliance stores. And stores that sell pretty standard goods like grocery stores or liquor stores, where there's no real benefit from walking from store to store to compare their goods, don't generally cluster. So food and beverage stores do not cluster. There's no significant coefficient there. And also miscellaneous store retailers like general stores, CVS's and so forth, are rarely found clustering with each other because the clustering doesn't actually bring in more customers to them. So I'm going to skip through the coordination section, which I was going to talk about business improvement districts and bids, and how business owners can come together to form clusters that actually can augment or expand some of the benefits. And I'm going to go ahead and talk instead about the last section, which I hope to have a little bit of time for, about COVID impacts, because I'm sure it's on many people's minds about how COVID has impacted the outcome. And it indeed has been a really tough year for street commerce in particular, but also all other forms of brick and mortar retail. Shopping malls have had a terrible year as well. And the only winner perhaps of this year has been online retail, or the Amazons of the world. So I want to preempt and say that the troubles that this year has brought along onto retail and service actors on American city streets did not just start with COVID. There has been a number of forces affecting and oftentimes threatening street commerce or other retailers in American cities that predate COVID. First, obviously, is the rise of e-commerce that goes back already a decade, but has really steadily continued to grow. And even though before COVID, roughly 11% of all retail sales in the US were online, with COVID, it's gone up to roughly 16% or rising. E-commerce was a major force that's already been there that predates COVID. Second, because partly the effect of e-commerce, there's been a steady shift that street front spaces, the shop fronts we were talking about, have been steadily shifting from retail to services. You may have noticed in your own local main streets or town centers how many places that used to be a retailer in the past have converted to a restaurant or some other service provision, where services are rendered on site and it's not a place where you sort of go in, pay money, and walk off with goods. This is partly because services find it easier to compete with online competition than retailers. You know, it's hard to convince somebody to pay more money and undertake a physically arduous trip to buy something they can buy as easily online. But restaurants and other services do not face that competition online. There's no food provision online, or at least until COVID-19, it seemed like restaurants are pretty immune to e-commerce, and that's also changed slightly in COVID-19. Third, there's been just an abundance of retail space in the United States. There's about twice as much of retail space per capita in the United States as there is in the UK. So there's been oversupply, and many of the change have been growing on over-leveraged loans. And you know, when times went bad, they found it incredibly hard to service these loans, and lots of bankruptcies occurred, not necessarily because of e-commerce competition, etc., but because of this very over-leveraged, tenuous, fragile kind of expansion plan that many chains had embarked upon. Fourth, I would argue that retail leasing structure has also been partly to blame, because lots of retail spaces go out on very long-term leases, on 10-year leases, 20-year leases, sometimes even longer, sometimes 5 years. And so lots of landlords have an incentive to keep a space vacant for a long time, because they're hoping for somebody to come in and sign that 20-year deal. And we need solutions for shorter term fillings. And this has partly been occurring with pop-up stores and other more creative mechanisms, but the retail leasing structure needs somewhat of an overhaul to make it possible to be more agile and respond to market demands more quickly, especially under unusual circumstances like COVID. Fourth, what's been really interesting in the retail market is there's a genuine problem, especially in highly popular areas, to have a lack of affordable retail space. So in the planning profession, we have come up as a community over decades to the problems of, so we've come up with solutions that try to address the systemic and structural problems of housing affordability. And we've come up with solutions that make it possible for the local governments to convince developers to put aside a certain percentage of units at below market rates, at affordable rates, so everyone can live there. We do not generally have anything comparable to for amenities or for retail spaces. So oftentimes in successful areas, even if you have some affordable housing, there may not be any amenities available that service populations at affordable rates. So we need more innovative policies that would enable community serving, highly valued retailers to set up shop in places that people demand them, where they cannot afford market rate rents. And that's too been to be blamed for the sort of some of the retail problems we already observed before COVID. So I want to show some recent data and examples of what's happened with COVID. We did a study again in the Boston area using cell phone track records that have monitored at a sort of aggregate anonymous scale how people change their behavior in terms of going to retail clusters. This was done in and around Somerville, Massachusetts. If you think about the factors that affect visits to retail clusters, we can sort of put them into three bins. The built environment shapes how that plays out, regulations shape how that play out, especially during COVID with the closures and shutdown orders, and of course, people's preferences. So in this study, we particularly focused on the preferences. You can think about this from an individual store perspective. I've put up an example of a Target store, which in 2019 spring drew customers from primarily from these census block groups that I've drawn the sort of graph red lines out to, with the thickness of the line representing how many people came from that census block group. And it had a very different pattern in 2020, generally a relatively large drop, but even the reallocation of where people came from, because some of the population was more cautious than others in even going to the stores. The store types that lost most customers in the early phase of the pandemic were some clothing stores, furniture stores, and hotels in the Boston area. On the other hand, hardware stores or home improvement stores and grocery stores, despite the fact that they also lost, about a third or even close to half of their customers compared to the year before were the least impacted. So they did relatively the best given the circumstance, whereas places like furniture and clothing stores often lost 80% or plus even of all their customers. So here, the trend line plotted in red shows the relative decrease in visits from expected levels across all retail clusters in and around Somerville and Cambridge. So if we look at the 0% line, that would be based on last year's trends, that would be the expected number of visits in each month. But we see that when the pandemic arrived in March and April, across the whole environment of retail clusters, there were over 80% loss. And that was steadily kind of growing, but still by the end of the year in December 2020, around the turn of the year, still we stood at around 70% below expected line, so a tremendous loss. But what's also interesting about this graph is that each of the gray bubbles is an individual retail cluster in the area. And you can see that some clusters individually actually punched above the line. Some clusters had more visits during the pandemic than they did the year before. And this has been particularly interesting. So I show visits to different clusters over 3 months here. So this is February 2019 compared to February 2020. This is right before the pandemic arrived. Year on year trends are very similar. There's very little difference between 19 and 20 in February. If we look at April, then April 2020 has lost enormous amounts of its visits compared to April 2019. It's on average 88% lower than the year before across all clusters. And it's, as I showed, it climbs up as a year proceeds, but even in December 2020, at almost a year into the pandemic, the retail visits or amenity visits were still far down, 65% down from the expected level. So there were, this map here charts how individual clusters lost out. For instance, down the dark red cluster along Central Square and Massachusetts Avenue lost 92% of its visitors. But there are a few plotted in blue, especially one up here in the South Medford Street, that didn't only lose customers, it gained customers, and it gained roughly 200% customers compared to the year before. So you have to wonder, why such heterogeneity? Why do some clusters actually do far better in the pandemic, and why do most of them do so bad? The ones that generally did the worst and lost the most customers and were hit the hardest were those that relied on employees as their daily visitors. So this cluster along Mass Ave here in Harvard Square, universities were shut down, the employment was all home. They lost almost everyone who on a daily basis visited them. But the South Medford cluster is in the midst of a residential area. And this was a story with many other retail clusters too, that in residential areas, actually things picked up. And this one in particular happens to be an ethnic cluster and has a few very popular Brazilian stores. In fact, this Oasis Cafe is a very popular buffet, a Brazilian grill buffet and barbecue. And there's another very popular Italian place right next to it. And Somerville has a very strong sort of Brazilian construction workforce sector, and construction never stopped during the pandemic through the public regulations. The construction jobs kept going. It was deemed as a non-hazardous activity, and it became a place where both the working population but also the residential population area would just go in and keep patronizing. And they had their best year on the books throughout the pandemic. And I've heard something like similar cases from other residential areas where trips now originate from homes rather than workplaces, and some of the residential retail clusters actually did relatively well. Either they lost less than many other clusters downtown, or in some instances like here, even gained customers throughout the pandemic, which was a surprise to us all. The last thing I will mention, and then I'll stop talking and we'll hopefully have some Q&A time still, is that people's sensitivity to distance has diminished during the pandemic. So I've plotted here a kind of a chart that looks at the how the y-axis of the chart is flipped so that the higher negative numbers go up and 0 is in the bottom. But it shows you in the sort of vertical axis how sensitive people are to distance. And what generally that means for retail clusters is that if people are more sensitive to distance, they prefer local clusters. They go to where it's cheaper or closer to go to. And in some ways, from an urban planning perspective, that's a good thing, that people will prefer to walk or cycle or do a short drive to their local cluster. What has happened effectively in the pandemic and has stayed like that so far is that people have become less sensitive to distance. That means they're willing to go further and be more picky and selective about where they patronize, what clusters they go to. In part, this is a logical outcome of the fact that people are at home or were at home and they still had their cars, so they could for safety reasons stay in their cars and go very selectively to places they like to go to, and their schedule are more flexible. They don't depend on the 9-to-5 work schedules. Their retail trips are not structured only on the weekend, so they are more flexible to choose. But it's also hazardous news for planning, because now that people are willing to again travel longer distances across their cities, we see an uptick in traffic, and we might see a preference again towards big box shopping on the further out. So not necessarily good news for street commerce at the local scale that really relies on people coming on foot from nearby distances. So this is a worrisome trend that I think we'll have to deal with for years to come, because if people are less sensitive to distance, meaning they're willing to travel further, we're back toward restructuring land use patterns and retail clusters that cater to passengers coming increasingly by car. So I won't go into any more of this, and we'll just end here and rather have a conversation. Thank you very much.
Okay, great. Wow, you have unpackaged quite a bit. Folks, if you have questions, go ahead and type them in. We'll see how many we can get to. Hold on, I can't do two things at once here. Let me get my webcam on. Oh, good, you got your screen down. Okay, let's get going. This was great, a lot of information. So the first question that we have coming through, can we make estimations as to the sustainability of a deviation from the trend line for a community based off of this trend line? So are there implications for how we think about economic development in those communities?
I suspect this question is about the trend line earlier on the slideshow about the size of how many stores a town can sustain.
Yep.
And sorry, can you just repeat the first part of it? So can we make projections about
the sustainability of a deviation from the trend line?
Yeah. No, I think what's really, those deviations are the most interesting part of that graph. So on the one hand, there's a high degree of predictability, but really, like, where do towns achieve far more amenities than you would expect from their populations, or far less, is really the juicy and interesting story for planning, because much of it depends on planning, right? And so I think sustainability really depends on how people, the continuous effort on local governments, on planners, and also on local businesses in kind of upkeeping a certain culture. If a place relies on tourism, and that's why it has so much retail to offer, because many of the customers come from outside of the bounds of the city itself, in the long term, I would imagine that many tourist places, well, the pandemic has shown that that's not necessarily the safest place to put all in the eggs either, because we had an enormous reduction in tourism, and many of such places suffered. The retail clusters that did well this year were those that relied on local catchments and local residents, and those who relied on either employees or tourists generally suffered a great deal. But I think the sustainability and the long-term kind of viability of such economies really depends on the upkeep and whether the town policies and investments keep up with attracting the tourists and attracting the outside visitors to the stores. And if those are in line, I think generally would expect them to keep impacting the visits as they have.
Okay, Thank you. Next question, how do you determine how much income goes towards fixed costs for determining the number of customers or catchment area needed?
Yeah, those are actually, they really depend on the different types of goods. So there's high margin goods and low margin goods. So, you know, typical low margin goods are highly competitive groceries and so forth. And in such businesses, very little profits are made on any variable costs, and very little can be set aside. So you need an enormous volume. So if in a grocery store, for every receipt you get, you can only put aside maybe 5% or 10% for fixed costs, then you need a really high volume of receipts to cover those costs, and that's why they're high volume businesses. But in other places, in other sectors like luxury goods or say handbags, they're very high margin businesses. So you know they may oftentimes get over 75% of the incoming fees can actually go directly to offsetting fixed costs, and so it really depends on the type of good.
I know you kind of skipped over a little bit. I saw some slides regarding lifestyle centers. If we could just chat for a few minutes about those. I guess in your opinion, in terms of the clustering and just all the data that you have, do they apply to lifestyle centers, or are they sort of their own sort of beast?
No, they're in many ways their own beast, and I apologize for not having the time to go more into depth about that, because I was hoping to, but I just went not fast enough, I guess. Lifestyle centers are really a new version of the shopping mall. They're centrally owned, centrally managed, and they control store entry, so they can choose which stores participate or which don't, right? What's unique about them is that on the one hand, physically, they have become a lot more like Main Street. They have hidden away the parking, and oftentimes the stores are entered from the outside. There's no longer the classic atrium of the shopping mall. The atrium is gone, and the Main Street has replaced it. So circulation happens outdoors with storefronts. And then second, they are generally much more mixed use, right? It's not just shopping, but they're meant to keep the person around for a whole day or half a day. I mean, this was actually the original premise of the shopping center when shopping centers appeared in the modern incarnation in the 1950s, and they were meant to be there. You know, you would go for a whole day. They would have concerts and all kinds of, and so lifestyle centers have picked that up. And so there's cinemas, there's lots of good food options, and there's also some mixed uses and some residences and jobs sometimes baked into them. And they're generally so far, maybe because they're new comparatively to the old shopping mall, they tend to be high end. They cater to high end customers. So I haven't seen lifestyle centers that are explicitly catering to a broader audience. And so, but in the grand scheme of things, what I talk about in the book would still consider lifestyle centers just a new version of the shopping mall. So it's a different story in a sense that it is coordinated and it's centrally owned, and that gives it a huge amount of leverage, and it helps compete with very old places. For instance, here even in Boston, there's a big lifestyle center called Assembly Row that has come to being in just the last 10 years, and you know it competes head on with a place like Harvard Square that's 200 years old, and just within 10 years it can build up so much momentum because of that coordinated clustering activity. You pick store entry, and stores have different differential leases, which fragmented clusters never can compete with. So in fragmented clusters, generally landlords ask the highest rent they can from every store, whereas in the shopping center, the owner could give a very good deal to an attractive store that brings in all the customers, and then in turn charge high leases from those other stores that get the spillovers.
So my opinion, and what do I know? We try with our webcast series to kind of look as forward as we can and kind of help our planners anticipate what's coming down the line. In my opinion, I kind of feel like lifestyle centers are already on their way out, only because they are they look like the new modern shopping mall, and you know, the eat, play, work, sleep, you know, this whole thing, it was really fascinating at first, especially because it looked so much better than a shopping mall, and it was reminiscent of the old main street. So you thought, oh, this is trendy, this is where I want to be. But now I sort of look at it like, okay, one, it's pulling from all of the retail anywhere else in the community that's just already kind of hanging on a thread. And two, because it does sort of replace the shopping mall, are we looking at it like these are going to become the empty shopping malls in 10 years because e-commerce is so popular now, and all of these stores are going to start to become obsolete, and we're going to have empty lifestyle centers?
Right.
What do you think about? I mean, this is just all my whatever,
no,
but
it's a genuine possibility or a threat. And I think what we're witnessing is also that the sort of new urban population who can afford to live in centers increasingly values this sort of authentic, old or locally owned kind of retail environment that people, can see a difference between a chain restaurant in a lifestyle mall versus an authentic local area restaurant run by a local chef catering from a local farm, etc. And there's increasing demand for that kind of stuff. I don't know whether we can talk about this in such a way, though, in general across the country, because these sort of walkable centers where retail is actually accessible on foot. Think about parts of Chicago or Washington, D.C. or Boston, San Francisco, and LA and so forth. We're still talking about a fairly small chunk of the country, and there is a whole lot of America that still very much depends on shopping centers, including lifestyle centers. And this idea of having amenities that you can get to without necessarily hopping in a car is really an exception rather than rule across the country, right? And so I don't think that I don't know if that's their fate is as threatened in many cities of the US, but I do think in places where you have genuine alternatives, where you actually have walkable streets to choose instead of the shopping center, in those instances, indeed, there seems to be an increasing pressure and interest by the customers to choose what's more authentic.
And how, with COVID, and even really before COVID, e-commerce and buying a lot of the retail things that you would normally buy, even grocery shopping, is now all online. So how do all the trend lines, how are they going to be adapting to this new era of retail online?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, one of the sort of trends that has been occurring is that the street fronting retail or amenity space has increasingly been transitioning from retail to services. So food and restaurants are a perfect example of services, but also others. And some of the street fronting retail has been really investing into a higher degree of service for the customers. So they have humans that can provide you really good advice on site. And unfortunately, oftentimes that also comes with the higher cost. But I do think that one of the key things that we're seeing is that the street-based retail cannot really compete on price anymore. It's so far. Well, let me take that back a bit. There are some real budget kinds of retailers like the dollar stores and so forth that online commerce hasn't really conquered yet, because the population it caters to is not online. They're not people who buy with credit cards and shop on Amazon every day, and that has still stayed on the main street, right? But a lot of the sort of mid-market retail that used to compete on price finds it extremely hard, because Amazon will underbid them and you'll have all the vendors online. So increasingly we see the transition to services. What I think is been a worrisome trend throughout COVID is that we actually saw that even restaurants can be threatened by online commerce. And this is because everybody started ordering food from restaurants online, and they went through apps like Uber Eats or Grubhub and others. And up until that point, I think most people didn't realize that restaurants are potentially vulnerable to the e-commerce powers as well. And so what I've been seeing some of the city governments actively promote is to help the local vendors and restaurants connect through more sort of the apps that have a more sort of local mission. For instance, Uber Eats will take a 25% cut from every sales is processed from a restaurant, but there's alternatives like Toast or others who will take a much smaller cut, whose whole mission statement is to promote local retail. And so lots of cities have sort of tried to kind of figure out ways in which to build awareness and training for restaurant operators to not necessarily be subjected to the sort of predatory cuts that very large companies will take from their fees, and rather how to do it themselves, how to have their own online ordering platforms and circumvent the kind of others doing that.
In our last 2-3 minutes here, so I guess retail commerce, it's constantly a moving target. Things ebb and flow, things constantly change. With COVID, things change very quickly. How should our planners online be thinking about zoning and ways in which we can ensure that our zoning can meet the ever-changing needs of commerce?
Yeah, I think there is actually two facets to zoning that are really interesting. On the one hand, I really believe that we have in terms of density and like where land uses are in the bigger picture in cities, we have to keep pushing for the TODs. We have to keep pushing for higher density environments where you have this sort of round-the-clock demand that actually produces non-motorized trips in a local scale around the clock. But when you think about the zoning on the street and the use-based zoning for commercial spaces, I do think innovation is needed to have much more flexible categories. And actually in the book, I describe some things like in Singapore, there is this interesting category for zoning called activity-based uses, or activity ABUs, or activity. So essentially, it's a flexible zoning category that says, on this lot, you can put activity-generated uses, AGUs, activity-generated use, and that's a very flexible category, which includes retail. It even includes some like art-related things, like art galleries sometimes. It includes services, food services, as well as personal services and entertainment. So it's not a zoning category that says that this has to be commercial retail space. It's a much more flexible bundle, and that enables the market to more flexibly figure out what might go there, rather than saying, okay, sorry, we have a restaurant who wants to come here, but the zoning doesn't allow it, right? The other innovation in terms of like this lot-based zoning or land use categories I talk about in the book a bit is an interesting innovation that we've seen where sometimes the same space has two tenants that take turns temporally. So in the morning, it's let's say a breakfast restaurant, and in the evening, a different tenant takes over. And you still need institutional innovation to make that possible, because you technically have two businesses that are liable and responsible for that space. And to enable those kind of shorter term pop-up type of things to take place, I think actually helps ease some of the requirements. So if a restaurant cannot or a store cannot afford to be there, maybe they can afford to be there 50% of the time, and they pay 50% of the fees. And so that makes it possible to revive some of that.
That is interesting. And on that note, we have to wrap up, but there are a ton of questions that we didn't get to. This was so great. So thank you for joining us. This was a lot to cover, so thank you. And thanks to the Urban Design and Preservation Division for hosting today's session. Folks, we are recording this. I'll have it up on our YouTube channel probably by Monday. We'll also have a PDF of this slide deck available on our website. Head over to ohioplanning.org/planningwebcasts, and you can register for upcoming sessions. I know the Urban Design and Preservation Division has 2 more sessions, I think maybe September, November, coming down the line here. So watch out for those as well. Thank you for joining us. This was really great. Everyone, hey, have a great weekend, and we'll talk next time.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.